It is a real joy to be here at St. Luke's Hilton Head again. This is, I think, my third, if not my fourth visit to Hilton Head. And then I'd come a long, long time ago to visit a friend, and we stopped by and looked around the church. So I've been aware of St. Luke's for a long, long time. But the delight of coming back is the number of you that I recognize. May not have names and faces together, but to come into a place where you have begun to recognize faces and realize that you're in amongst friends is a real joy. So it is great to be with you all this morning. JD told me that I could finish as early as I wanted, and nobody would complain. So we could just be done, But then JD has the guitar that I want. This is the Taylor 416 Cutaway. That's the guitar I'm dreaming of. And my wife keeps saying, when our youngest is out of college and we're not paying tuition anymore, yeah, then I can rent one. No, our first month's tuition payment, when we no longer have a tuition payment, we'll buy the guitar. So that's my dream. Now, Beth thinks it might buy something else, but anyway, let's pray together. Heavenly Father, your mercies are new every morning. Your faithfulness is great. And so we come to you as people loved by you, bought by you, redeemed by you, and made alive again in you. And so we offer you ourselves today, and we pray that you would capture our hearts, capture our imaginations, that the lives that we live from henceforth would be more fully committed to you than they have been to now. In Jesus' name, amen. So Paul writes in Romans 12, the first couple of verses, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, what I want to do is really briefly unpack just a few ideas from this passage. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of my time telling you the stories of two people who I think, more than any other two people I have met, embody what it looks like to be a living sacrifice to God. And I do that in hopes that it might make you think anew about your own life and the ways that you live your lives. Oftentimes, the best helps to us as we try to live faithfully are not the teachers, but the examples that we have. So, Paul talks about this call that he puts on us to be living sacrifices, which if you stop and think about it, like me, I think most of you have heard that language enough that we become a little bit numb to what Paul is calling us. But if you think about the business of sacrifice in the Old Testament, to be alive in that does not seem to be a very good deal, right? Slaughtered, put on a pyre, burned. And Paul says, I want you to be a living sacrifice. He is intentionally reaching back into the Old Testament and he's grabbing temple language. Think about the worshipers who would come to God with their offerings. And I think that what Paul is looking at here, there are different kinds. If you go through the book of Leviticus, there are all sorts of different kinds of offerings that we're invited to give. Sin offerings and thank offerings and burnt offerings. What Paul is alluding to, I think, is the burnt offering, which is, the burnt offering is what you offer to God as a way of showing your commitment, your devotion to God. So it's not a sin offering, which is, I've really messed up and I need to offer some sort of atonement. But a burnt offering was a testimony of me giving myself and my gifts to God. It's a way of saying everything that I have, Lord, is yours. We do a similar thing on Sunday mornings when we take up our offering and we say, all things come of you, O Lord, and everything that we have comes from you. And so that's what is in mind for Paul, this idea of what does it look like to offer ourselves wholly and completely to God as his people. And this idea of a living sacrifice is, I think, deliberately paradoxical. Paul is trying to jar us. He's trying to catch our attention. He knows, as well as anybody else, that sacrifices are always, they end up at least dead. It's part of what it means to be a sacrifice. And so Paul is saying something along the lines of, I want you to be a living, slain thing. He says the exact same kind of thing when he's writing to the Galatians, and he says, I've been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life that I now live, I live by the grace of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So Paul is saying here very similar thing to what he said in Galatians. And he's calling us to offer everything that we are, the way that we live in the world, in a completely different way than we have done before. So the old way of living in the world dies off, part of that sacrificial activity, and then we emerge new and alive to Christ Jesus. So to be a living sacrifice simply means dedicating every part of our life to God. How we see ourselves, which is changed and lifted up by the gospel, and how we work, making sure that we treat people fairly, even if it means sacrificing for our own selves, and recognizing that as we live and as we work, we should use our unique talents and gifts not so much for our own self-interest and our own gain, but to serve others and to spread the gospel. Now, when he says, I want you to be a living sacrifice, he says, here's the challenge. That we tend to be conformed to the ways of the world, which is to say, we think and do just like everybody else thinks and does. I remember one time I was taking a preaching class when I was in seminary, and the professor, I would sort of say he was kind of an old school guy, and he had been raised in, I don't know if you know, does the Keswick movement, Keswick theology make any sort of sense to you? Part of the Keswick theology was that it's possible for the redeemed Christian to live apart from sin, right? Which just, God love the Keswick folks. I don't buy it. At least it's not true to my experience. And so he's teaching on preaching. He says to our class one day, he says, now, you will have to really study and attend to the kinds of troubles and issues that the people in your congregation are going through. And I remember thinking, study and attend to? Like, those are my struggles. Those are my problems, right? I mean, I have all this, like, I sit there and I watch a football game on TV, and the Cadillac commercial comes on, and the Cadillac people know how to appeal to me just as much as they know how to appeal to the people in my congregation, right? I have all the same desires. I have all the same interests. And so Paul says that's part of the reality of it. We are conformed, that is to say, we have been put into the same mold as everybody else. It's interesting here, he uses these two words, conformed and transformed, in a unique way. And another one of my seminary professors used to say that a word is like a bait bucket. You know, the bucket's got some sort of, there's the bit at the bottom where it holds a certain amount of water in, and you can keep the little tadpoles or whatever you're fishing with. And then there's a bunch of holes in the side, so if you dip it down into the water, you know, water can flow in and out. So he said a word has a kind of at the bottom this sort of base meaning, but then it also takes and gives from the context that it's in. So here, when Paul uses the word conformed, he's using it in order to juxtapose it to the word transformed. Now, you'll know if you've read Paul's epistles that there are other places where he uses the word conformed as a great thing, to be conformed to Christ. But here he's trying to get at kind of a difference between sort of semantically what conformed means versus what transformed means. So the Greek word conform is syschematizo, which means sort of to be molded into a pattern. It's a word that means being shaped and pressed into something by outside forces. On the other hand, he uses the word transform as something that means something that kind of comes up out of you from the inside, something that is new and different. So the word that Paul uses for transformed there is metamorpho, which we get our word metamorphosis from. And if you're like me, the only place you ever really paid any attention to the word metamorphosis was when you were in like third grade science class and you learned about caterpillars, whatever it is, going through metamorphosis and becoming butterflies, right? And so Paul is trying to set up here the difference between these external forces that press us into something and these internal things that are true to the nature of who we are. And remember, Paul is writing to people who he knows have been redeemed. So what's inside of them is not just the old sort of crusty, messed up old man, but Christ is now dwelling in them. So he wants that to well up from inside so that they become shaped into the same kind of thing as Jesus. So just here's a quick, easy example. This may be the only thing you remember. Jell-O, right? Anybody ever made Jell-O? Beth tells this wonderful story. Get her to tell it sometime if you're ever with her. She got invited to a women's gathering at our church in Orlando. This is a long time ago. This is in the early 90s. And she said she went to the lunch and there was not one thing on the table that was not in a Jell-O mold. Right? Everything, right? I mean, that was sort of an era in cooking, right? Everything on the table was in a Jell-O mold. And so even ham had been forced into this shape that ham is not supposed to be forced into. So a Jell-O is, there on the one hand, it's this thing that gets shaped and formed, but there's also something about Jell-O that happens. It's this hardening, this sort of gellifying from a liquid. Right? So it, according to its nature, moves from one thing into another kind of thing. And that's what Paul is trying to get us to see. And he wants us to be transformed, he goes on to say, by the renewing of your mind. Right? So I think what Paul is getting at, let me just give you Paul as an example. So Paul was this incredibly well-educated Pharisee. And one of the things Paul knew as he looked back on everything that he'd learned about the Old Testament, one of the things that he knew for a fact comes from Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy says that cursed is anything that hangs upon a tree. And so he knew that Jesus could not be the Messiah because Jesus had hung on a tree to die. So he had this lens through which all of the things that he knew were working. Until a moment came when he actually met Jesus on the road and he got knocked off his horse. And everything changed. And here's the thing. Paul did not have to go back to school. Right? Paul had all of the knowledge that he needed. But what happened was the cross changed from being a testimony of the curse of God to a testimony of the triumph of God over death and sin. And suddenly, it's sort of like, like a Rolodex. It's like he suddenly looks back on everything he knows, and it's like everything falls into place in a different way. So he had all the knowledge. All he needed was this renewing, this change of way of seeing. I'm going to take the time to quote my favorite theologian of all times, Bob Dylan, in his song, "Change My Way of Thinking." He says, I'm going to change my way of thinking, make myself a different set of rules. I'm going to put my best foot forward, stop being influenced by fools. Then he says, don't know which one is worse, doing your own thing, just being cool. You remember about the brass ring, but you forget the golden rule. Right? So Paul is calling us to forget the brass ring and embrace the golden rule, to change our way of thinking, to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Now, with that as background, I want to tell you the story of two people whose lives have impacted mine in amazing ways. Some of you, any Pittsburghers here? Yeah, there's probably more than a few. You might know the name Bob Lavelle. Anyone? Bob Lavelle? I see a smile. Bob Lavelle is one of my heroes. If I could have a Bob Lavelle medallion that I hung around my neck, I would. Bob Lavelle was born in Cleveland, Tennessee. His dad was a pastor. He was one of a bunch of kids. And they had a very difficult life. Bob Lavelle grew up poor. He was born in 1915, so he was a teenager through the Great Depression. Everybody in his family left Cleveland, and they all went different ways to sort of try to find their way in the world, to try to find work, to try to make it in the world. He ended up in Pittsburgh. He ended up living in the infamous Hill District of Pittsburgh. And in the Hill District in Pittsburgh, he got a job with the Pittsburgh Courier. The Pittsburgh Courier was, at the time, Pittsburgh's only black-owned newspaper. And he started working his way up the ladder. He began as a delivery boy, and he just moved his way on up through the business until the World War II broke out, and he enlisted and went off to war. When he came back from war, he was eligible for the GI Bill, and so he went to school. And he went to the University of Pittsburgh, got his bachelor's and his master's in business, and he began to sell real estate. He was in the Hill District. If you don't know the Hill District in Pittsburgh, think of the old TV show Hill Street Blues. That TV show. It's very gritty. It was kind of a groundbreaking television show, but it was about the Hill District in Pittsburgh. That's the hill that they were having their blues about. Anyway, and so he begins selling real estate in the Hill District. And it didn't take him long to realize that something in the system just wasn't right. And the way, the only time I ever heard him speak, the way that he said it was this. He said, it struck me as fundamentally wrong that a wealthy white person could come to a bank and get a third mortgage to buy a boat, when they already had a second mortgage on a second house and a first mortgage on their first house. But a black man who was trying to provide a house for his family could not get a mortgage. And he said, that just struck me as wrong. And so he joined the board of Dwelling House Savings and Loan, which was a black-owned savings and loan in the Hill District in Pittsburgh, and they were not doing very well. And so he joined the board, and I think it was like his first or second meeting, the president of the bank said, why don't you just take the bank over? And so he ended up purchasing Dwelling House Savings and Loan. And he did something completely different than any other bank was doing at the time. He went to everybody that he knew, and that was mostly Christians in Pittsburgh. So he would go to churches, and he would make presentations, and he would say, here's what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to take a portion of your portfolio. Doesn't have to be a huge portion. But I want you to take a portion of your portfolio and invest it in my bank, and I will promise you, no matter what's going on in the market, I will promise you 3% return on your investment. Guaranteed 3%. Now, there are times when your savings can be producing 11, 14, 18, 19%. There are other times where 3% looks good, right? But he was just saying, if you will invest with me at 3%, he said, then what I can do is I can make a loan to somebody who needs to buy their first home at 5 or 6%. Now, there have been times when 5 or 6% would be higher than the market. But when Bob Lavelle was doing this in the early 70s, mid-70s, interest rates were 8, 9, they got up at one point to as high as 14, 15, 18%, right? And so he was saying, if you would but sacrifice a little bit of what you own and invest it with me, I promise you, you'll make 3%. But then I can make loans to people who the banks won't give loans to. Right? So he wrote about, he noticed that what was happening in Pittsburgh, in his neighborhood, was that African Americans like him were not able to create wealth and stability for their families. But not only that, when you don't own your home, your investment in your neighborhood, your personal investment, is very low. He once said this: urban homeowners have a stake in the land where they are. They not only want to stay out of trouble, but they also want to keep trouble from coming into their neighborhood. In suburban areas, where home ownership is something like 95%, there's no question about the city services being excellent. The homeowners demand it, and they pay for it. So he said that the families are more stable, they have something to pass on their children, they become taxpayers, and therefore the police and fire protection and schools and garbage service, all those things improve if home ownership can improve. So he begins to get people to invest in his vision for dwelling house savings and loan. And as things go on, he begins to see people in the neighborhood buying homes through loans they got. But there was a challenge. A lot of these were folks that didn't have the kind of just financial common sense that most home buyers have. So when it came time at the end of the month to make their mortgage payment and they had an opportunity to do something else with their money, sometimes they would. So Bob Laval would have to go house to house to people who had gotten loans with him and sit down with them in their living rooms and teach them about budgeting and how to manage their money. And he would say to them, look, if you don't make this payment, then I won't be able to loan money to your neighbors and they won't be able to buy their houses. I need you to make your loan payment so that we can keep doing that and so that our neighborhood could get better and better. And so not only did he come up with this idea for banking, but he began investing himself in the lives of the people around him. There's a great story told. There was a time when his insurance company came to him and they said, look, your savings and loan is in the worst part of Pittsburgh and you don't have bars on your windows and your doors. If you don't put bars on your windows and your doors, we're going to have to drop you because it's too great of a risk for us. And he went to the president of the insurance company. He said, if you make me put bars on my windows and doors, then I'm sending a message to my neighborhood that I don't trust them. I cannot afford to send them that message. I am begging you, don't raise my rates and don't make me put bars and windows on my doors. And they didn't. He talked them out of it. There was a day when a couple of thugs came into his bank to rob him. And the tellers were sort of, like you might expect yourself to be. They were afraid and everything. He heard the commotion going on. He came out. He saw what was happening. He went up to the guys and he said, look, I don't know who you are, but I guarantee that you have an auntie or you have a grandmother who has a loan with my bank and who's been able to buy their home because of my bank. If you rob me, you will ruin all of that. He said, now I'll give you $100 from my own account, just from my own, if you will please go away and leave my bank alone. And nobody ever tried to rob him again after that. Right? Because he fully invested himself in his neighborhood. Now, the story has not such a great ending. It has a great ending in the sense that by the time Dwelling House Savings and Loan closed in 2009, I think it was, home ownership in the Hill District went from less than 10% to over 60%. He transformed that neighborhood just by his vision that things could be done differently. By the renewing of his mind, he was transformed, and because of that, as he began to pour himself out, no longer just thinking of himself, but he began to pour himself out for others, the neighborhood was transformed as well. One of the sad things is there were things that Bob Laval was amazing at, and there were some things that he wasn't so good at, and one of the things he wasn't good at was technology. And so over time, he got sort of any number of notes from the FDIC about how he needed to upgrade his systems and things like that to stay current with the times, and not all of them he did. And in 2008 and 2009, a couple times his bank systems were hacked and millions of dollars were stolen from his bank. And so there was $3 million that had been stolen from his bank. And he had any number of investors who had come to him saying, look, we'll give you the we'll fix that. We'll give you the money. And the FDIC initially was going to let them sort of invest in the bank and make it solvent again. And I think it was in the week before they were supposed to sign whatever the papers were, they were hacked another time, and another $1 million was stolen, and so the FDIC closed them down. But Bob Laval, transformed by the renewing of his mind, made an enormous impact in the world for good. He gave himself as a living sacrifice to God. There's a guy named Bob Wazinski. Bob teaches at Ball State University. He's a sociologist and he studies Christians, of all things. And he wrote a book one time called The Transforming Story of Dwelling House Savings and Loan, a Pittsburgh bank's fight against urban poverty. Now, here's the thing. I will tell you that you could do a lot worse than going out and buying that book, Bob Wazinski's Transforming Story of Dwelling House Savings and Loan. The problem is, it's out of print, and I just saw a copy on Amazon for $265 yesterday. So I haven't bought it yet, waiting for the price to come down. But here's one of the things that Bob said about Bob and Dwelling House Savings and Loan. He said, Dwelling House is the most biblically sensitive and Christian institution I have ever seen. They incorporate more biblical insights than any church or nonprofit I know, and I have seen a lot. They brought racial reconciliation, mercy, justice, goodness, stewardship, and love to the business of buying and selling houses. Bob died in 2010 at 95 years old, and he was, I think, an amazing example of somebody whose life became a living sacrifice, transformed by the renewing of his mind. So, the second person that I want to tell you about is actually a guy who is a friend of mine. You might know him too. He lives in Charleston. George Green is an engineer, and he's not a bad one. He got his bachelor's degree in engineering from Florida, a master's degree from Columbia, New York, and then his PhD in engineering from Tulane University. He and his wife Molly moved overseas. They worked in Germany for a while. When they came back, he came back to New Jersey and worked with Exxon in their research and engineering department for a long time. In 1981, he and Molly and their 2 children at the time moved to Charleston, where he founded a company. He wanted to leave sort of the big corporate engineering world and found his own company. So he founded a company called General Engineering Laboratories. That was in 1981. 1982, their 3rd child came on the scene. So just kind of put yourself in his position, right? He had left a really large corporate, well-paying job because he had this dream, this vision of setting up his own company. So they moved, he grew up in the Low Country, so they moved back to Charleston to start this company, his wife and 3 kids. It was the era of new government regulations in the early 80s. The government was looking for all kinds of regulations, and because of that, GEL, his company, began growing really, really fast. He said for the first dozen years that they were in business, that they grew 40% per year every year for those 12 years, which is to say they doubled in size about every 2.5 or 3 years. So the company was incredibly successful. It continues to be one of the largest privately held engineering firms in the United States. George and Molly together were Christians in the way that lots and lots of Americans of their era are Christians, which is to say they'd grown up in church. They knew that church was something that you ought to do, that it was good for you, it was probably good for your neighborhood. But they didn't have any real particular Christian commitments. Just like many people, after they had their second child, Molly came to George and said, "Don't you think we ought to go to church? Don't you think we ought to, sort of do what our parents did for us and, make sure that we're good people and go to church?" So he said, "Sure, let's do that." He's a happy, compliant guy, and his wife wanted to do something, so he went along. Fortunately, let's say providentially, they got into a church that was incredibly strong, a church not unlike this one, where you heard the gospel of Jesus proclaimed. You knew that it was possible to have a relationship with Jesus Christ that was salvific, that could actually transform your life. And they really came to know Jesus. In fact, George came to know Jesus in such a way that I remember him giving his testimony once, and he said, "I've only in my life really heard the Lord speak to me on 2 occasions. The first is when I was wrestling with this desire to want to leave Exxon and found GEL. And I was sitting up one evening and I was praying, "Lord, what would you have me to do? Do you want me to do this company?" And he said, "I've heard very clearly, yes." So he said, I woke Molly up the next morning and told her about my dream. And she said, "George, if that's what you feel called to do, I'm in. Let's move." And so they moved to Charleston. They set up the company. Their faith matured, and it got them to the point where once they moved to Charleston, they had a third son, John Christian. And their faith had grown so much that in December of 1984, when their 2-year-old son wandered out into the backyard and ended up drowning in the creek behind their house, George says you come to a moment where you will either say, "God, I'm done with you," or, "God, I have no hope except for you." And George said, we knew enough to know that second option was the only real option that we had. And so they pressed in to their faith in God in the midst of that incredibly challenging loss. They clung to their faith. They clung to the hope of the resurrection. And that experience formed them even more deeply. And it created in them a capacity to trust God like they had never trusted him before. So the company continues to grow. And one year he was on a sales trip down to Atlanta. It was early November 1998. And he's driving back from the sales visit. He's listening to the news on the radio, and he hears about Hurricane Mitch striking Honduras and Nicaragua. And I don't know if you remember Hurricane Mitch. I don't, but I Googled it and looked it up. Hurricane Mitch was an incredibly powerful storm that hit Central America, came in right at where Honduras and Nicaragua are, and then it stalled. And it dumped rain for days and days and days. The estimate is that 11,000 people died the first day of that storm. So it was absolute chaos and destruction in Honduras and Nicaragua. And George, who didn't really know, had no idea what might happen, he said, the only thing I knew is I knew Bishop Revd, who was the Bishop of Honduras at the time. And he said, so that night I got home, and just before I went to bed, I opened up my computer, and I sent an email to Bishop Revd, and I just said, hey, what can we do to help? We know a little bit about water. Because a lot of the work that they did as a company was, water testing and things like that. And he said, I actually thought that I had sort of discharged my duty. I didn't think I'd ever hear from him. I didn't think, I just thought, hey, I did my best and sort of tried. He said the next morning they got up and there was an email back from Leo Frade who said, we desperately need 6 drinking water units. So he went to Molly at breakfast and he said, Molly, I sent this email, I got this back, what do we do? And she said, well, we got to do something. So they began researching, looking for units that they could buy to send to Honduras. The only unit that they could find, a portable, you could go in, set it up, water cleaning unit, was the Army Corps of Engineers had developed it. The Army used it for themselves, but it would cost them $250,000 a unit. And so he said, that was out of the question. That just was not happening. So he went to work, his job, that is. He went to his work. And he also went to work, right? But he went to work, he got his folks together, and he said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to figure out how to build some drinking water units. And they have to, one, meet the U.S. drinking water standard. So whatever is good enough to come out of your tap had to come out of their drinking water unit. Has to be built to last at least 6 months, just to get them through the hard part of this storm. Has to be built so that it doesn't require specialized training or even knowledge of English. So we can dump it off and people can figure out how to hook it up and use it without any... And we have to be able to build it from readily available parts. Like we can go to the Home Depot and we can buy everything we need to build a drinking water unit that does this. They ended up building 6 of them, and just a few weeks later, they were on an airplane that Molly had arranged through the United States Air Force to transport them. 17 people from his company volunteered to go and help with this. So 17 folks, 6 water units, and 50 tons of supplies, emergency supplies. They had put out word to the churches in and around our diocese, and some other churches helped too, to collect things that people would need. And they went to Honduras. And that trip changed George's life. It introduced George for the first time to the Global Water Challenge. I don't know if you know this, but in the year 2000, there were about 1 billion people in the world who don't have access to drinking water. Now, there's actually a clear definition for what access to drinking water means, and that is you have to be able to travel less than 1 kilometer in order to access clear drinking water. 1 billion people in the world in the year 2000 didn't have that kind of access. And so he decided that there should be something that they could do about them. So he and GEL, his company, began building and delivering these water units to places that had disasters and natural catastrophes. So earthquakes and hurricanes, they sent units to El Salvador, to Turkey, to Mozambique, to Honduras. Anywhere that they heard of that needed clean water, they sent these units out. And as they did more and more of that side of the business grew and grew, and he realized that the drinking water business was not really part of what GEL was supposed to be doing. It wasn't really the company's brief. And so he and Molly took a Saturday, they went away. He said it was just Molly and me and a Bible and prayer. And we said, Lord, what would you have us do? Now remember, these are people who trust Jesus now, right? And he said, the Lord told them, this was the second time that the Lord spoke, that they were supposed to sell GEL and devote their lives fully to what has now become known as Water Mission. And so he and Molly came back, sold his business to one of his partners, and they established Water Mission. As they were clear on 2 things. It had to be a nonprofit. He said, if you go into this in the profit business, you are subject to so many government regulations and, from all the governments everywhere. You just can't do it. And then the second thing he said was we wanted it to be distinctly Christian, which is to say that if clean water was going to be brought in, we wanted the living water to be brought in as well. So they began Water Mission, and they began doing this kind of work all over the world. And then in July of 2019, disaster struck the Green family one more time. They were vacationing in the Bahamas, Molly and George and their kids and their grandkids. George was out in the backyard with his son. They were doing some work. Molly came out. She said, hey, I'm taking the two of the grandkids down to the beach. She kissed him on the cheek, and he says, that was the last time I ever saw her alive. One of the kids got caught in an undertow. Molly went out to rescue him, was able to rescue the grandchild, but she herself died. And George says he sunk into a darkness and a depression like he'd never known before. And he said to God, I'm done. I'm out. I've had enough. He happened to go and have an appointment with his priest. I don't know if you know, he used to be clergy in our diocese. Now he's a bishop in the ACNA, a guy named Terrell Glenn. I don't know if you know Terrell. Terrell is a wonderful guy. He's been a huge help in my life. But he and George were sitting there talking, and George said to Terrell, I read Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And he said, but I just cannot see what good could ever possibly come from this. And Terrell said, well, look, if you're going to read Romans 8:28, you have to read 8:29 as well, where God says that this stuff is happening for the good, that you might be conformed to the image of his Son. So what does it look like in this to be conformed into the image of his Son? And they wrestled together, and they prayed together, and they talked together, and then they ended up talking about water mission and why George just didn't feel like he could go on with it. And Terrell didn't know much about the drinking water challenge. I'm almost out of time. But he said, he told Terrell, this is now in 2020, and interestingly, in 2000, there were 1 billion people who did not have access to clean water. By 2020, 2 billion people did not have access to clean water. One of the way George says it, he says, between 2000 and 2020, we had brought clean drinking water to 7 million people. And he said, but if you subtract 7 million from 2 billion, you still have 2 billion, right? We hadn't even begun, But anyway, George told Terrell the fact that 2,300 people die every day from lack of access to drinking water. And he said, Terrell sat bolt upright in his chair. And he said, George, do you not see what the Lord is telling you? He said, you're telling me that every single day, 2,300 families in the world enter into the same kind of grief that you're going through right now. And God has given you the capacity to do something about that. And so George set himself back to the work of water mission. And that work continues to today. So why do I tell you about Bob Lavelle and George Green? Because, at least for me, and I want them to be for you, examples that might stimulate your imagination to ask the question, what would my life look like if I offered myself as a living sacrifice? If I allowed the Lord to renew my mind in such a way that I saw the world differently than I currently see it, that I found a way to die to myself, to give myself completely to serving God's people, to give myself to discerning what the kingdom values look like and what is required from us as we follow Jesus, not conforming ourselves to this world, not chasing the brass ring, as Dylan said, but being transformed by the renewing of our mind to think differently and to live differently in the world, not, again, to quote Dylan, not forgetting about the golden rule. So I appeal to you, by the mercies of God, to present yourselves a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Thank you.